But although general logic cannot give directions to the faculty of judgment, the case is very different as regards transcendental logic, insomuch that it appears to be the especial duty of the latter to secure and direct, by means of determinate rules, the faculty of judgment in the employment of the pure understanding. For, as a doctrine, that is, as an endeavor to enlarge the sphere of the understanding in regard to pure a priori cognitions, philosophy is worse than useless. Since from all the attempts hitherto made, little or no ground has been gained. But as a critique in order to guard against the mistakes of the faculty of judgment, lapsus judici, in the employment of the few pure conceptions of the understanding which we possess, although its use is in this case purely negative, philosophy is called upon to apply all its acuteness and penetration. Immanuel Kant. With this lecture, I will sort of conclude my lectures on Kant's epistemology, that is, his theory of cognition, and I will get into one of his main insights, or the core of what his point is in the critique of pure reason. So far, what I had said is that cognition has two parts, a sensual and an intellectual part. Our sensuality gives us perceptions, and they are the matter, the content of all our cognition, or rather of our experience. And then, on the other hand, the intellect as the faculty of rules, the faculty of concepts, the faculty of general representations, as opposed to the sensuality's singular representations, the intellect gives concepts and thereby provides the form. The content, that is the perceptions, is connected and brought into a systematic form, and thereby it becomes experience, by the intellect. And in previous lectures I talked about how the intellect has these 12 categories that are pure intellectual concepts that don't come out of experience, but rather are necessary to even make experience, and that therefore every experience has to conform to. And in the very last lecture I gave, I talked about the role of the power of judgment, which, if we are now considering only the determining power of judgment, not so much the reflecting one, which is the faculty of subsuming specific individual cases under the general rules. Which is the faculty that allows us to apply the rules, the concepts that our intellect has, to sensuality. And for most people, I think this would be enough. Most people would be content hearing this. And if Kant had ended his talk about how our process of experience works in the critique of pure reason here, then I think the casual reader, as much as you can read the critique of pure reason casually, the casual reader might not have felt that there was anything missing. But Kant, as a philosopher, goes deeper. He realizes there is something crucial missing still. Because the intellect's concepts and the perceptions we get through our sensuality, they are too different. They don't mix, they don't have any connection. They are like oil and water. So how could the concepts, these discursive general representations, and how could our perceptions, these intuitive singular perceptions, singular representations, how could they possibly connect with each other? This is a problem that, if you generalize it a bit, is a very, very old problem in philosophy. It is a problem every sort of dualism is faced with. If you have two components that are completely different, there's always this issue of how would they connect. So, for example, you have in the history of philosophy the very famous body-soul problem. How can the body and the soul, an extended thing and a thinking thing, how can they possibly be connected? By the way, I will soon get to what Kant has to say about that when I get to, well, what Kant says about the soul, about rational psychology, and about the paralogisms of reason in that area. And for Kant, this issue of the connection of the two different parts in a dualism is like a red thread that goes through his whole philosophy. In the lecture on what is science to Kant, I already talked about how to him there is pure science, metaphysics, and then there's applied science, empirical science, and how in his last unfinished work he tried to wrestle with the problem of the transition from one to the other, saying there needs to be a sort of bridge between them. And also in the lecture on what is philosophy to Kant, I said that there's theoretical and practical philosophy to him, but he says that the concept of purposiveness, and in my previous lecture I talked about how that is a pure concept of the reflecting power of judgment, how that concept connects these two fields of philosophy. Well, and this always repeating problem of Kant's, this is what we find here too. How can the concepts and that come from the intellect and the sensual perceptions, how can they be connected? And this leads to the chapter on the schematism in the critique of pure reason, which is something that is often overlooked. Like, you will probably not find too many videos, for example, here on YouTube about it. Whenever there's a more broad, more general, more casual presentation on what Kant says in the critique of pure reason, the chapter on the schematism is usually left out completely, which is a shame because really it in a way contains the core or the main result of the whole critique. And it is immensely important, actually. But it is also very difficult. I would say it is, together with the passage on the apperception, about which I already talked in another lecture, I would say it's probably one of the two most difficult parts of the critique of pure reason. Kant himself acknowledges its difficulty. And that might be one reason it's often left out, either because the people talking about Kant find it too difficult to summarize and explain to others, or because they found it too difficult to understand even and gloss over it because they themselves might not have understood it fully. I hope that I will be able in this lecture to explain it further. I ask you to bear with me. It will be probably a bit abstract and a bit complicated at first, because I will first talk in general about what the schematism means. But then later on, I will get more concrete and try to give specific explanations and examples, which I hope will make what I will have said before that more clear. So bear with me for this one. It's called schematism because that thing which is to connect the intellectual with the sensual, is called a schema by Kant. As I said, it's like wanting to mix oil and water. You cannot do that if you have just oil and water. What you need is a third substance which allows you to connect them both. And for that to be possible, that third substance needs to be a sort of middle thing that can connect with each of them. The same is true for the schema. Kant would say that you can't connect a concept with essential perception directly. What you need is this middle thing, which has some resemblance to sensuality, but also some resemblance to intellectuality. So there needs to be some third thing in which both these parts align. So Kant says, for example, that you couldn't apply the pure concept of a circle, the mathematical concept of a circle, to a plate if they didn't both contain roundness. Since they are both round, the circle and the plate, they have something in common and therefore can be connected. So here the roundness would be sort of the schema to connect them. The schemata are creations of the power of imagination. I talked about this power in my lecture on sensuality. And there I said that according to Kant, the power of imagination is part of our sensuality along with the sense, but it is that part which connects the sensuality with the intellect. And it does mainly through the schemata. What the schema is a little hard to describe in general terms. It's also a little hard to give an example, as this is something, the schematism, that happens unconsciously, and it happens, so to say, before experience. It makes experience possible. That's why it's hard to give an example out of experience. But maybe you can imagine, when I tell you to imagine a tree, you will probably have this image of a tree in your head, but it will probably be a vague and unspecific image. Like, you won't probably imagine an oak tree or an apple tree or a cherry tree or a chestnut tree, but just a tree. It will probably have leaves that are green, but in your imagination the leaves will probably not have a specific shape, like the leaves of an oak tree or the leaves of a chestnut or whatever. So there is this weird in-between between the actual perception you would have of an actual tree and the mere abstract and completely non-sensual concept of what a tree is. The schema, Kant says, is not so much an image, it is rather the representation of a general procedure of the power of imagination to give a concept its image. As I said, the schema has to contain something of both, of the intellectual and of the sensual, and therefore Kant describes it as the representation of a general method. That would be the intellectual side, right? This generality, because the intellect doesn't have specific representations. It is always a general faculty. It always has general representations. It's the faculty of rules, after all, of general rules. So the schema is the representation sort of a general method, but a method of connecting the sensual data and giving the sensual data to the intellect, and that would be the sensual side. So you may have a specific dog in front of you, which then will have specific attributes that go beyond mere dogness. He will have a specific color, maybe it's a brown dog. He will have a specific height, maybe it's a small dog, and so on. So you have this specific perception. And if you had just that, the perception of another dog, let's say this dog is brown, the other dog is black, would be different. And you would not be able to apply one and the same concept, that of dogness, to both of them. So you need this schema of the dog, this representation of the method through which the power of imagination takes up all these attributes, the color and the sound of the barking and so on, the smell of the dog, and combines them into the representation of a four-legged, barking, friendly animal, to which you can then apply the concept of dogness. Now, Kant calls the power of imagination the empirical power of imagination when it apprehends the various sense impressions to synthesize them into one image which we can perceive. This process of apprehension is something I covered in its own lecture, and this is obviously, an empirical process, because here I have sensual impressions, and that is what empirical means to Kant. Empirical is everything, so to say, filled with sense impressions, while pure is everything not containing sense impressions. So since this apprehension is based on the sense impressions, since it is nothing else but taking up these sense impressions, and then synthesizing them into one apprehension, one image that can be perceived. Since that is the case, the power of imagination is empirical here. When it comes to the schematism, Kant talks of the pure power of imagination, because, it's not empirical. And this pure power of imagination needs to give a schema even to empirical concepts. But of course, what Kant is most interested in is the pure intellectual concepts, or more specifically, the categories. And here he talks of the transcendental power of imagination, and this schemata he calls transcendental schemata, so the schemata belonging to the categories. Remember, I talked about this in my lecture on transcendental idealism. Remember that to Kant, transcendental refers to the conditions of the possibility of experience. So the power of imagination is transcendental here, and these schemata are transcendental because they are needed to even have experience. Without them, it wouldn't be possible. Well, how can we apply our categories, such as the concept of causality? How can we apply it to the sensual, to our experience? Just like the circle and the plate with the roundness, there must be a third which they have in common. And this third Kant finds in our forms of viewing, which I already covered in my lecture on sensuality and time and space as the forms of viewing. Because they, on the one hand, they are sensual, right? They are, after all, the forms in which our sensuality happens. The forms, time and space, time as the form of the inner sense and space of the outer sense, the forms in which I view my sense impressions, the forms of my receptiveness. On the other hand, though, if I take them not as the empirical viewing, which is filled with such sensations, but if I rather abstract from all sensations and look at just these pure forms of viewing, time and space not being filled, so to say, with a specific content, then this is something they have in common with intellectuality and with the categories, because they too are pure, they too are non-empirical. And that is why these forms of viewing are what makes the schematism possible. So I should not speak in plural, actually, because Kant bases the schemata only on time, not on space. And if you wonder why that is, well, that is simply because, as I covered in the lecture on sensuality and time and space as forms of viewing, because space is only the form of viewing of the outer sense. So in space, I view everything outside of me as extended bodies. But time is the form of viewing of the inner sense. So in time, I view my own representations, my own thoughts, my own sensations and feelings and desires. And since everything which I perceive through the outer sense, I still perceive inside of me, in my own consciousness, time is sort of more fundamental than space. So there are things I can view that are not in space, like my own feelings, but there's nothing I can view which is not in time. That is why time is more fundamental to Kant, and that is why the schematism is only based on time. So what the transcendental schemata are is basically the categories, so to say, filled with time, or time underlaying the categories. So when it comes to the mathematical categories, there's only one schema per group, so one for quantity and one for quality. When it comes to the dynamical categories, there's one schema corresponding to each category. I will now first talk about what these schemata are. And once again, bear with me for a while, because that too will be kind of abstract and maybe it will not immediately be clear. But then afterward, I will talk about, well, what all of this is about and what the implications of this are. And then it will hopefully become more clear. So what schemata does Kant talk about? Well, first, the transcendental schema of quantity. It refers to the series, to the succession of time, Kant says. Because how do we know that something is a quantity? How do we know that we have one, or that we have many, or that we have everything? Kant says only through the succession of time and through in time adding one to the other. So doesn't matter how much time this takes up, if it takes a lot of time or maybe just a second, but I can understand something to be a quantity. So for example, I look at a forest and I see many trees there, because in time I sort of perceive one tree and then the other tree and the other tree, and I add these up, succeeding each other in time, these representations of various trees, to get to this quantity. And that is why the schema of quantity to Kant is number. Numbers to him are not purely intellectual concepts. They are also obviously not perceptions. I don't perceive a number. Rather, they are in between. They are schemata, or rather, they are the schema specifically of quantity, because that is what a number is according to Kant. It is in the succession of time adding one to the other. So the number 3, for example, would start from 1, and then as time passes on, I add another 1 to 1, so I have 2, and then again I add another 1 to 2, so now I have 3. Maybe you can see that in small children, in elementary school children that are just learning to count. If you give them a number like, let's say, 20, they maybe don't immediately know what 20 is. They have to count step by step. They have to maybe take an actual sensual object, like maybe their pencils, and then they have to add one to the other in the succession of time. So that is the schema of quantity, the number, the series, the succession of time. The schema of quality is about the content of time. It is about filled time. Because how do you know that something has reality? And here you should think back on my lecture on the table of categories and remember that reality as one of the categories of quality does not mean the same as existence. It refers to the reality of an attribute. So the being there of an attribute, of a predicate in a thing, in a subject, without making a statement on whether that thing with this attribute exists or not. But then how do you know that something has reality? By time being filled up with it. So you can say that the redness of my t-shirt is there, it has reality, because a certain time when you look at the t-shirt is filled up with this sensation of red. Or the heat of the sun has reality because, once again, a certain time when you are standing in the hot summer sun is filled up, has this content of heat. And on the other hand, if you think about the category of negation, how can you negate something? How can you say something is not there? So, for example, how can you say that my t-shirt is not blue? Well, because no time is filled up with this sensation. When you look at my t-shirt, the same time in which you look at my t-shirt doesn't contain this sensation of blue. Another time when you look at something else might contain that sensation, but the time while you are looking at my t-shirt does not contain the blue sense impression. So therefore, filled time or empty time, so more generally the content of time, that would be the schema of the quality. Now turning to the categories of relation. The schema of substantiality is permanence in time. So how would you know that something is a substance and not an accident? How would you know that the rose is a substance but the redness is just an accident? Well, because that is a substance which has permanence, so which stays even though its accidents change. So the red of the rose may turn brown when the rose is drying up. So you know that the redness was just an accident. But there's something beneath those changing accidents which permanently stays, and that is therefore the substance. And the three transcendental schemata corresponding with the three categories of relation, they are, Kant says, about the order of time. So the order, the interrelation of different moments in time. So the schema of substantiality is permanence in time. How do you know that something is a substance and not an accident? Because it is permanent, because it stays even when the accidents change. So in the rose, the redness may change. The rose may dry up and then the red may become brown. So therefore you know it's an accident. That which under these changing accidents remains the same, that would be the substance. Well, the schema of causality would be the succession of the manifold in time, but in this time, not like in the schema of quantity, which was also about a succession of time, but the schema of quantity is about the addition of one thing, one real thing in time to another of the same kind. So then you can say you have a quantity if in the succeeding time you can add one part to another part of the same time. When it comes to causality, cause and effect can be of completely different kinds, so that's not what matters. And also, their addition is not arbitrary. You cannot start from one or from the other direction, right? So when I, for example, look at a forest, I can enter the forest from this side or from that side. I can I can start counting the trees from this tree or from that tree. It doesn't matter. But when I see someone, some lumberjack cutting down one of the trees, I will first see him cutting down the tree with his axe, and then I will see the tree falling, and then I will see the tree lying on the ground. Here, this succession is not arbitrary. I can't see the tree lying on the ground first and then see it falling and then see the axe hacking the tree. That makes no sense. That would be time going backward. So the schema of causality is the succession in time according to a rule. So one perception having to follow another perception, precisely because it is caused by that other perception. And then the schema of the category of community, that schema is the being at the same time of the accidents of two different substances. So I know that these substances are in community when their accidents are in the same time. But again, it must not be by coincidence. It must not be arbitrary. Like it is possible that one clock shows a certain time, and in the same moment I'm scratching myself. That doesn't mean that I'm in community with that clock, and that me scratching myself is the cause of that clock showing this time, and this clock showing this time is the cause of me scratching myself. There's no mutual action happening here. So for this schema, it's not just about the accidents of two substances being in the same time, but rather they have to be in the same time according to a rule. So their being in the same time has to depend on each other according to a rule. So like with the schema of causality, where the mere succession is not enough, here the mere being at the same time is not enough. Both schemata also contain a rule according to which this succession or this being at the same time happens. Well, and lastly, the schemata of modality, Kant says, are about the complex of time, or about the totality of time, you could say. So the schema of possibility is the synthesis of several representations fitting together with the condition of time as such. What Kant means by that is that something is possible when its various parts, so the various representations you can have, can fit together into the same time. It is impossible if they can't fit together into the same time. So let's say being alive and being dead. When you say it's not possible to be alive and dead, I could answer, yes, it is possible. Kant was alive at some point till 1804, and now he's dead. So Kant could be said to be both alive and dead. What is impossible is only for both of this to happen at the same time. So Kant was alive and now is dead at a different time. And it is not possible for these two attributes, being alive and being dead, to fit into the same time. And that is why this is impossible. The schema of existence would be a thing being in a specific, in a determined time. And the schema of necessity would be a thing being in every time, right? So if something is necessary, if it must exist, how would you know that it is necessary? Because it would have to exist at every time. There could be no time where it doesn't exist. While something which merely is existing but not necessarily existing could exist at a specific time. So I could say Kant existed, but it was not necessary that such a person as Immanuel Kant had to exist, and therefore Kant filled a specific determined time, the time between 1724 and 1804, but Kant didn't fill the whole time. So these are all of the transcendental schemata, of which there are 8 and not 12, because the mathematical categories, they both can be described by one general schema. Now, as I said, this whole schematism is a little abstract and a little difficult, so maybe so far you didn't quite understand what this is about, but I think it's not so important to get all the details, so to get every specific schema that Kant is talking about. Rather, what is important here is getting his main point that he's making with the schematism. What is this point? Well, the categories as such, they are empty. They don't really mean anything to us. It is only through the schemata that the categories actually attain meaning. So once again, we go back to Kant's famous statement that, yes, sure, viewing without concepts is blind. You don't know what you are perceiving if you don't have a concept of it. Like the archaeologist who dug up something new and doesn't yet know, was it a tool, was it a cult requisite, or whatever. But on the other hand, concepts or thoughts without content are empty. So Kant's point is that these 12 concepts we have, I mean, what are they? I explained that in the previous lectures, but let me stress it again. What they are is they are based on the 12 functions of our judgment. So all my thinking is making connections, is bringing things together, is synthesizing. And I have these 12 ways of doing that. I have 12 ways of synthesizing various representations. Now, if I reflect on these 12 ways, I get the 12 categories, these 12 pure intellectual concepts, which are like the basic forms that all my thoughts need to have, because all my thoughts are a synthesis of the manifold. All my thoughts are connections, and these are the 12 sorts of connections I can make. These are the 12 forms I can give to things. But the categories, just as such as the categories, they would be completely empty forms. I mean, in order to connect, to make a synthesis, you need to have some sort of content which you can connect, out of which you can form a synthesis, right? You can take up Legos and you can build them into a house or into a castle, but in order to do this, to give them this connection, you first need the Legos. If you don't have any Legos, you can create the best plans, the best architectonic plans in your head for how you would build with Legos, but you don't have Legos. And you don't even know if Legos exist. So if your plans could be realized, possibly. And that is Kant's point. The categories as such, they don't get us anywhere because they are nothing but forms, and forms need to be given to a content or else they are empty. The categories are nothing but the concepts of how to synthesize, and so I need a content that I'm synthesizing, and this content needs to be essential, and time is the essential form of all our sensuality. So therefore this content needs to be temporal. So what Kant is really saying is that without time, the categories mean nothing to us, and we don't even know if the things that we are thinking in the categories, if they are even possible. Since this is very abstract, maybe it is best to make this more clear if I give you the challenge of trying to think any of the 12 categories without its schema. Usually we don't do that. Usually we sort of put the schema under the category, even if it happens unconsciously. So most of the time when thinking one of the categories, even if we don't reflect on it, we are already thinking time. But if you try to abstract from time, and therefore from anything sensual, and just think the category as such, you will realize that you won't get very far. Let's try with 4 examples from all 4 titles of categories. So let's start with quantity. If you want to think a quantity, in sensuality that is easy. You think many trees in a forest or many sheep in a herd of sheep or whatever. And these can be numbered. They can be counted in time, meaning you can have one representation of one sheep, and then in the succession of time you can add another and another and another representation, and therefore give a number. But now try to think of quantity without time, without the succession of time. How would you know that there are many of a thing if these many parts don't follow each other in time? So when we talk about the supersensual, that which isn't in time, we may still talk about quantities. We may claim there are many souls or many angels. We may claim there are many heavens, like maybe there are 7 layers of heaven. We may even claim there are many gods if we are polytheists. But then, what is that to mean, this many and not one? If we try to make sense of it, we can't help but imagining this multitude, and therefore imagining it in a sensual way. So I will then imagine the many layers of heaven as something through which I can ascend. But then there's time. I'm first in the first heaven, and then I'm in second heaven, and then the third heaven. Or I will think of the host of angels as, well, many blonde winged dudes sitting on clouds. So I could sort of walk around in heaven and count the angels. Or I will think of the many gods as sitting on Mount Olympus, for example, where you could count them in the succession of time. And if you try to truly abstract from time, there is no way how you could, well, realize that there is a multitude. Or let's go over to quality. How can you know of a reality being there? Once again, through the schema, it's easy. You know that something has reality because a certain time is filled with it. You know that the redness, you know of the redness of my t-shirt because the time of looking at the t-shirt is filled with the sensation of red. You know of the reality of heat because the time that you are touching the hot object is filled with that sensation. But now, if you want to say that something has reality outside of time, and again, sure, we can claim this, we can make these statements. Our thinking, the pure thinking with the categories, can go beyond sensuality and therefore can go without the schemata. It's just that it is completely empty. So I can't say that in God the almightiness or being all-knowing have reality. I can claim that. But I wouldn't know how to realize that they are real, except by experiencing them in time. So experiencing God's almightiness, for example, by him doing some mighty act, creating the world or causing a miracle or whatever, which I would perceive in time. Outside of time, I cannot really understand how I could say that something is real and that something else is not real, how I could negate something else. in time, I can say real is that which affects me in a certain time, and negating I will do, and I will negate that which doesn't affect me in a certain time. Or also, let's consider the categories of relation. How would you know of something being a substance without the temporal schema of its permanence? Because if you just take the category of substance and just the definition of that category, what it means for something to be a substance and not an accident, the definition of substance as such, Kant stresses, does not contain permanence, because there can't be permanence without time, and time is sensual. It is not part of the definition of a pure intellectual concept. The definition of a substance is just something which is not an attribute of another thing, but rather existing on its own, so to say. That is the definition. But if you try to think about how do I know that a thing falls under this rule, right? Every concept is always a rule. So this concept of substantiality is the rule of not being the attribute of something else, but rather depending on itself. Okay, fine, that is the rule I'm thinking. I can think this rule perfectly fine without any sensuality mixed in. But how do I know whether I'm allowed to apply this rule to an object or not? I can only apply it to an object which has permanence in time, because then I know it is not another thing's attribute. Only those things that change, that have no permanence, are attributes, are accidents. But outside of time, how could I know that something is a substance? And in fact, Kant goes further. He says, I could not even know if something like a substance even exists. So I can't just say the soul is a substance. And the same holds true for causality. Again, if I abstract from any temporal conditions and just ask, what am I thinking without the schema? What am I thinking when I'm thinking of causality? Then Kant says, well, the definition of causality is that when you posit one thing, another thing is necessarily posited as well. So when there is A, there must be B. Simply because A exists, B must exist. That is the definition of causality. That would mean A is the cause of B. But how would I know this? I can understand what this means through time. I can say, okay, if in time A happens first and then B follows with necessity, so not just by accidents B happens after A, but rather there's a rule according to which B has to happen after A. B has to succeed A in time, every time. Then, okay, I can understand A and B to be cause and effect. But outside of time, how would I realize that B is because of A, if they are both not temporal? And how would I realize that something like causality could even exist? Because Kant stresses that these categories I have, they are my thoughts, right? They are formed out of me reflecting on how I connect representations. It could be possible that there is nothing in the world corresponding to a certain category. They could be purely subjective. Maybe I can think of a substance. I have this thought in my head. I can think of a thing that is not another thing's attribute, but its own thing. But maybe in the world there is no such thing. Maybe in the world everything is just the attribute of something else. Or I could think of causality in my head. I could think of something being the cause of something else. I could think that if A exists, B must exist simply by virtue of A existing. I could think that even in a world where there is no such thing as causality, where there is no A that by it existing causes the existence of B. Again, the categories are ways of connecting representations. It could be possible that I have among these 12 ways, there is maybe one or two, or maybe all 12 of them, there is maybe a way how I could potentially connect representations, but actually there would never be representations that would be fit to be connected in that way. That could be a possibility. So without a schema, I don't understand what my category really means. And I don't even understand, Kant says, if that category has any reality to it. If there's any object in the world corresponding to that category, or if it is just my thought that is entirely subjective and has nothing to do with the world. So that means I cannot apply the categories to things in themselves. I can apply them perfectly well to the things that appear to me, to the things I'm experiencing. Here the categories are not just subjective, here they are objective, because these objects depend on the categories. The categories are conditions of the possibility of the objects of my experience, because I cannot experience outside of the categories. But if I try to think of the categories without any sort of sensuality, so without the temporal schema, so without thinking of the categories as applied to things that could appear to me in time, then I don't know if I am even justified of using these categories. And lastly, the same could be said about the categories of modalities. So once again, let's look at possibility. How can you know if someone tells me it's not possible for you to talk to Kant, to have a conversation with Kant? I could ask why not. If I'm simply thinking about possibility without any temporal conditions, I don't see why it should be impossible for me to have a face-to-face conversation with Kant. Only if we add time to the equation and realize that, well, Kant died 190 years before I was born, so there was never a time in which both I and Kant existed at the same time. We exist at different times, then it becomes immediately obvious and self-evident to every human being that it is not possible for me to have a conversation with Kant. But if you try to think of possibility or impossibility without this temporal condition, then you can't really understand what it even means. Right? This is true for everything. When you say that a circle can't have angles, I mean, why can't a circle have angles? Because the circle is completely round. You are basically saying a round figure can't have angles. But if you, let's say, draw a square, it's entirely possible to then erase the angles and to redraw it as a circle of the same size. So once again, the impossibility is only in time. It is not possible for there to be angles and roundness at the same time. At different times, one and the same object could be round or could have angles or edges. There's no reason why that couldn't be. And this is why I'm saying that the schematism is sort of at the core of what Kant's point is in the Critique of Pure Reason. His point is, yes, we have these pure intellectual concepts. We have the categories and also the predicabilia out of combining certain categories. But we are only justified in using them with the temporal schema. So we can only use them applied to time, and therefore they are limited to being used referring to things that can appear in time. So referring to sensual things, to things that can affect us in time somehow. We are not justified in using them beyond sensuality, beyond time. We can use them beyond that, but that would be what Kant calls Schwärmerei in German, which you could translate as enthusiasm. So going beyond sensuality, flying around there in empty space, making things up, dreaming up all sorts of things, we can do that. So I can, of course, apply such concepts as substantiality or as God to as substantiality or as causality to God or to the soul. But really, they are empty concepts then. They are forms, they are a form of synthesis, of connecting without any content being connected. So I don't even know if this form would work. If this sort of connection that I can think up is even possible. And this is very important later on. Because it means that you can't make conclusions about the supersensual, about metaphysical objects based on the schemata. And in that way, the chapter on the schematism, the Critique of Pure Reason, is meant to serve the determining power of judgment in using the categories, because the determining power of judgment, after all, makes judgments. That is, it applies rules or concepts to specific cases. And here, this is about the application of the categories of the pure intellectual concepts. And the schematism should remind us that when doing so, when applying these rules, we must always do that using the temporal schemata. But of course, these schemata only work for sensual things, for things that actually can be temporal. So the point is that usually we actually do use these schemata, but we do so unconsciously. And we unconsciously, even when going beyond sensuality, don't use the pure concepts as such, but rather we use the concepts limited, narrowed down to their schemata. But we have no justification doing so. We have no justification to go beyond the sensual with the sensual schemata. So this is going to be very important later on for Kant's critique of the metaphysics of his time, because there were such arguments as, well, every substance is permanent. Substances cannot be destroyed. Every natural scientist knows this, that the matter or the energy in the world is not destroyed. It is only transformed in its attributes. Therefore, our soul, which also is a substance, must live on after death. Here Kant would say that yes, all substances are permanent. That is how we even know that something is a substance, by it being permanent. But this is only true for substances that can appear to us. So it is only true for sensual substances, for phenomenal substances. But noumenal substances, so a substance that doesn't appear to me, that I'm just thinking, like the soul, I have no reason to assume that the schema of permanence applies here. And therefore I can't make this conclusion that since all the sensual substances are permanent, the soul must also be permanent. Or likewise with the category of causality, there are such arguments as, well, everything needs to have a cause, so therefore there must be a first cause that caused the world, and therefore there must be a God. Here Kant would say, yes, everything needs to have a cause which came before in time. But again, this is only true in the realm of experience. So everything that can be experienced, every sensual thing, must have a cause preceding it in time. But that doesn't mean that the world as such, and the world as a whole, is not sensual. Its parts are sensual, but the whole is supersensual. That the world as such, as something supersensual, must have a cause, which is also supersensual, God, preceding it. This would be an unjustified conclusion. And that is why the schematism is so important. It teaches our power of judgment to limit its use, its application of the categories to sensual, to temporal objects. Because the categories can go beyond that, but then they are empty. We don't know if we are really thinking something or nothing. And if, because we feel that they would otherwise be empty, if we put the temporal schema under them and then still go beyond the realm of temporal experience, then we are making an error in judgment. So therefore, the conclusion of the critique of pure reason is that yes, synthetic judgments a priori are possible. It is possible to extend our knowledge without basing that extension on experience. We can take pure intellectual concepts, we can take our notions, that is the categories and also the predicabilia that can be derived from the categories, we can take those pure intellectual concepts and synthesize them with one another without any experience. But these judgments have to be made at least in time. And they have therefore to apply to things that can appear to me in time. I can therefore make synthetic judgments a priori, but only immanent judgments. That is, only judgments about the things of experience, not transcendent judgments. So the judgments can happen without experience, but they still cannot go beyond experience and transcend it and give me knowledge about God or the soul or whatever. And that is basically Kant's main insight. That is the point he's making with this whole over 500 pages of the critique of pure reason. And with that, I have one part of this lecture covered. That is the schematism. but Kant also talks about certain principles we have in our thinking, certain principles of the intellect. And these I also want to cover here. Kant says that the intellect forms certain principles, or Grundsätze, as he calls them in German, based on the categories and their schemata. And these now are the synthetic judgments a priori, about whose possibility the critique of pure reason was asking. So, based on the categories, but only the categories narrowed down through the temporal schemata, we make certain a priori synthetic judgments and derive at certain principles, which are principles of all our experience. So we can not apply these principles beyond our experience. That's Kant's whole point. But to experience, we can apply them, and we can, with absolute certainty, predict that all our experience will always happen according to these principles. Once again, the principles, like the schemata, follow the order of the table of categories. And once again, like with the schemata, there will only be one principle for the two mathematical category groups, but there will be one for each 6 of the dynamical categories. So all of this is based in the different ways the intellect can make connections, because connections in general, or conjunctions, as Kant would say, they can be distinguished into 2 groups of conjunctions. The first is the mathematical conjunctions, and these Kant calls compositions. And a composition is a sort of conjunction where you put together various parts of the same kind that don't have to be together. And this is exactly the sort of conjunction that mathematics deals with, Kant says, which is exactly the reason why he calls these principles mathematical principles, or why you could call the categories they are based on mathematical categories. Because if you think about it, mathematics deals with composition. It always deals with conjunctions of things that are the same, that are of the same kind. Like you can add x and x, for example, or you can add y and y, but you cannot add x and y because they are of a different kind. I can count how many sheep are there in a herd. I can count how many trees are there in a forest, but I cannot count sheep and trees together, unless, again, I see them as being of the same kind. So, for example, the kind living being. Then I can say how many living beings are here. And the conjunction in mathematics is not just a conjunction of things of the same kind, but it's also a conjunction that isn't necessary. So I can add quantities to each other in mathematics, but I don't have to. They could also stay separated. Once again, this mathematical conjunction Kant calls composition. And if you think of the word composition, you can think of music maybe, and here the same is true, right? The musician, the composer, he adds things of the same kind. So he adds sounds to each other. He's not adding sounds together with visuals or together with smells. That would go beyond composing music, but rather everything he's adding together is of one kind. It's always a sound, but these sounds don't have to go together. He decides to add this sound with that sound, and that is a composition. Well, and when it comes to the principles of composition, as I said, there are two, one for quantity and one for quality. For quantity, Kant calls the principle the axiom of viewing, or the axiom of intuition. And that axiom says that whatever I am viewing in time and space must have a certain extension in time and space. Right? And this is a synthetic judgment a priori. It is not analytic. Like, I can't just analyze the concept of something I'm viewing and realize that it must have an extension. It is synthetic, but it is synthetic a priori. So everything you see in space must be extended in space. It must start at point A and end at point B. Now, the extension could be huge, like the Earth, or it could be tiny. It could be not even a millimeter. It could be as tiny as an atom, or even tinier. That doesn't matter, but it does need to have some extension. It cannot be a mathematical point. You could not view a mathematical point in space. And the same can be said about time. Everything we view must be extended in time. Again, whether that's a big or a small extension, that we can't say a priori. Something could take just 1 second, or could take 100 years. But everything must start at a certain point in time A and end at another point in time B. And this principle, this axiom of viewing, this principle that everything must be extended, this is something we can be certain of a priori. And this is something I would challenge anyone with who disagrees with Kant's transcendental idealism, or who tries to say there are no synthetic judgments a priori. All these critics of Kant, I would challenge with especially this first principle, because it's maybe the most self-evident. If you go and you fly to another planet that no human being has seen before, then of course you can't say a priori what you will find there. You can't say, will it be more flat, or will there be tall mountains? You can't say, will it be deserted, or will there be life on that planet? That is something, of course, we can only find a posteriori. But what I do know a priori is that whatever I will see there will have a certain extension in space. I don't know a priori if the mountains there will be tall, or if there will just be small hills. And if there's life, I don't know a priori if there will be animals big like elephants or small like insects. But I do know a priori that everything there will have an extension in space. And likewise, if, for example, I eat something, I don't know before how long I will have this taste linger in my mouth. Will it vanish right away, or will it remain for a longer time? Or if I have a certain pain, I don't know a priori if the pain will go away after some seconds, or if it will stay with me for years. But that I do know a priori, that each and every taste, or each and every pain, or any other sort of sensation, must have a certain extension in time. And if you want to disagree with Kant's transcendental idealism, then I ask you, how else do you think you know this? This is obviously not a synthetic judgment a posteriori, because then we could just say, so far everything I viewed had an extension in time and space, but maybe I will someday view something with no extension. But no, we are absolutely certain that we will never experience such a day, that we will always only view things with an extension. We are certain of that because it's a synthetic judgment a priori. And it is also this axiom of viewing which allows for me to apply mathematics to the world, to everything I view. To apply, for example, geometry to everything I view in space. Because I know a priori that everything in space will be extended, and therefore the laws of extension, the laws according to which I can calculate extension in pure space, those laws have to apply to everything that I will view in space. So this first principle of quantity, this axiom of viewing, it deals with the form of our perceptions. Of course, in every perception, there's not just a form, not just empty space or time, there's also a content, a material. As I already explained in the lecture on sensuality, that content is always our sensations. And that's what the second principle, corresponding to the categories of quality, deals with. This principle Kant calls the anticipation of perception. And what this principle says a priori is that everything I perceive will have a certain intensity. It will have a certain degree. So once again, I can, of course, not say a priori what I will sense, what my impressions will be, but I can say that these impressions will have a certain intensity. Before entering a room that I've never entered, I don't know if the walls will be red or green or white, but that I do know, that whatever color they may have, that color will have a certain intensity. So if they are red, that red will either be a strong red or it will be a more weak, a more pale red. Likewise, if I eat something I haven't eaten before, like a new fruit, I don't know ahead, I don't know a priori how it will taste. Will it be sweet? Will it be bitter? But what I do know a priori is that the taste will have a certain intensity. So if it is sweet, the sweetness will either be very little, hard to even notice, or it will be very sweet, or it will even be so sweet that it's too much. Likewise, if it's bitter, maybe it will be a little bitter, maybe it will be very bitter. It will have some sort of intensity. And I could measure all these intensities, at least in theory, in degree. So often we do this, right? So we measure the intensity of heat in degrees of temperature, like degrees Celsius. But we can do that with everything that has a reality, with everything that could be sensed. So we can measure the degrees of lightness or darkness. We can give a scale of degrees of pain if we want to. We can give a scale of degrees of the hotness of a spicy meal, or the degrees of saltiness. Everything that can be an impression has a certain intensity and could therefore be sort of mathematically divided into different parts, into different degrees of intensity. And all of these can, in theory, be intensified, or they can, in theory, lose their intensity without ever reaching a minimum or a maximum. So if I have a lamp that has a certain degree of light, I can imagine it getting brighter. And I can imagine it getting brighter and brighter and brighter. Of course, physically, there's a limit as to what I can sense. I mean, at some degree of brightness, I would probably go blind. But still, the brightness could still be more intense than that, right? I mean, there are things that are more bright that I can take, like the sun. And the sun is not the brightest thing. There are other stars that have an even bigger intensity. So, and the same with hotness, right? Of course, physically, there's a limit to the hotness I can sense, because at some point, if something was too hot, I would just burn. But still, I can imagine the hotness being even more and more intense, and I can't imagine a maximum here. It can go on forever. And in the other direction, I can, of course, imagine a minimum. I can imagine negation. So I can imagine a certain sensation simply not being there at all, like no light at all, complete darkness, or no heat at all, complete cold. But if I am given a certain sensation, I can imagine the intensity of that sensation lessening and lessening without ever reaching zero. Because even if it's 1 degree above zero, I can still imagine it being a half degree above zero. And even then, I can still imagine it being a quarter degrees above zero, and so on. So no matter how small the number is gonna get, even if it's 0.000000001 degrees, it's still not nothing. Again, physically, maybe it's basically the same to nothing. Maybe the intensity is so low that I don't really consciously sense it. Like, I'm not aware that I'm still sensing something. I mean, when it comes to cold, I don't think we have to go to absolute zero before we will probably not be able to distinguish 1 degree above zero from absolute zero. But still, even if the intensity is so low that I may not sense the difference anymore consciously, I could still imagine a different intensity. I can still always imagine a degree of intensity that is lower than what is there, but still not quite zero. As Kant notes, it is curious that quantity has exactly one quality, and that is the quality of continuity. So there's always in each quantity, in each extension, there's a continuity. And quality, on the other hand, has exactly one quantity, and that is the degree. Each quality has a degree, so it can be measured in a quantitative way. But anyways, both of these mathematical principles are about the apprehension of the sensual manifold, and therefore about our perceptions. The axiom of viewing is about the form of perceptions being extended in time and space, and the anticipation of perception is about their content, being filled with sensations, with giving us impressions of a certain intensity. To Kant now, the point of these two mathematical principles, the axiom of viewing, saying everything must be extended, and the anticipation of perception, saying everything must have an intensity. The point of these principles is that our power of judgment should always follow them, and thereby they can prevent errors of judgment. One example that Kant gives is if you take two objects with the same volume. Let's say you have a ball of gold and a wooden ball, and they have a different weight. So the golden ball is more heavy than the wooden ball. how should we in physics, how should we explain this? One possible explanation that was favored by many natural scientists or metaphysicians in Kant's time, one possible explanation is, of course, that the golden ball has more density. So it contains more particles, more smallest parts, and they are more dense. There's less space between them, while the ball that is less heavy, the wooden ball in this example, has a lesser density. So even though it doesn't look like it for us, in fact, it contains less parts, less particles, and they are less close to each other. There are empty spaces in between them, and that explains why it would be lighter. And Kant says that, sure, that is a possible explanation. But what natural scientists don't realize when they assume this to be the explanation is that they are basing this on a metaphysical premise that is unproven. And that would be the premise that everything in the world has the same weight. So if we go to the level of the smallest particles, every particle has the same weight. And so therefore, if two objects with the same volume, so taking up the same space, have a different weight, it must mean that they contain a different number of particles. And therefore that one of them must contain some empty spaces between the particles. But that would mean assuming that the difference in quality, because heaviness is a quality, right? It is something that I sense, an impression that I have with a certain intensity. I feel when I hold the golden ball, and when I hold the wooden ball, I feel it pressed down on my hand with a different weight. And this explanation would assume that the different qualities must really come down to a difference in quantity. So if there is a different heaviness, it can only be because the quantity of the substance is different. And since it doesn't outwardly have a different quantity, it has the same volume in space, the different quantity must be inside. There must be empty spaces inside between the particles. But Kant says there is no reason to a priori assume this. Could be, but it isn't necessarily so. I mean, let's assume you have two dishes, and one is a little hot if you eat it, and the other is more hot. You don't have to assume that this is because the same spice, let's say some sort of chili, was used in different quantity. Like saying that maybe one dish contains 1 gram of spice, and the other dish contains 10 gram of the same spice. And that is the reason why the second one is more spicy and more hot. That could be, sure, but it could also be that they both contain just 1 gram of spice, and just that it is different spice, and one spice is more hot than the other. So it is entirely possible that the quantity is the same, and just the quality, so the intensity of the impression it causes, is different. And Kant says the same could be true when it comes to weight. There's nothing a priori that should make us certain that it is impossible for two smallest particles that have the same extension in space to also have the same weight. It could be possible that two particles with the same extension still cause a different intensity of weight. And natural scientists, Kant says, should at least be open for this possibility, and they must prove that one or the other explanation is true. They can't just assume one explanation, so the explanation of the different density, to be true and to be obvious, because once again, that would mean an error of judgment based on not correctly applying these principles of the intellect. And by the way, Kant did in fact assume that there is no such thing as empty space, that all space is filled with matter, even if it is matter of a very, very low intensity, so that we can't measure it in any possible way. So he did indeed assume that it is not a difference in density, but really a difference in quality, in the intensity of the heaviness, which explains that. But that I will talk about when I come to Kant's natural science and what he said about natural science. Here in the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant is not making a statement about which of the two explanations are true. He's just saying that we can't know a priori, so we can't make an assumption simply a priori for the one or the other explanation. We have to look further. The two mathematical principles tell us that every phenomenon, so everything ever appearing to me, is a continuum, both in the extension it has in time and space, in its form, and also in its matter, in the intensity it has. And that is the very reason and the very proof why we can apply mathematics to the phenomena, why natural science can depend on mathematics. And that was one thing that was important for Kant to prove, because while that was already done in his time by natural scientists, there were rationalist metaphysicians claiming that this was not really possible, claiming that geometry, for example, works in our head and has certain truths in our head, so to say, but cannot just be applied to the sensual objects. So in geometry, you can divide everything into ever smaller parts, right? I can take a line from A to B and I can divide it into half, and then I can take this half line and again divide it into half, and so on, and I will never get to a smallest part. I will surely get to physically, I will get to a limit where I can't properly draw it anymore. But in thinking, in my pure intuition, I can always divide the line further. And this is something that no one is gonna doubt. This is how geometry works. But the rationalist metaphysicians would still claim that the things in the world are made up of smallest parts that can't further be divided. And that would mean that the rules of geometry don't apply to the things, to the bodies in space. And it was important for Kant to show that this is wrong, that the rules of geometry do apply to things in space. So even if they can't be divided further and further physically necessarily, in terms of geometry, we can divide them infinitely. And this follows from these two mathematical principles, or in this case from the first mathematical principle. If every phenomenon is a continuum, because in a continuum there is no smallest part, that does mean I can apply mathematics both to the extensions in time and space and also to the degrees of intensity. And I can divide both of them mathematically how much I want without ever getting to a smallest part, without ever getting to a zero. But now to turn to the principles that are dynamic principles. Once again, all the principles are about some sort of conjunction, as Kant puts it, that the intellect does. The mathematical principles were about compositions, so about conjunction of different parts of the same kind that don't necessarily have to be in conjunction. Now, the dynamic principles, they are about a conjunction of different parts that are necessarily in conjunction, but on the other hand, that don't have to be of the same kind. And this sort of conjunction Kant calls the nexus. So this is, for example, what happens in causality, right? Here, the conjunction is necessary. For example, between the sun and the melting ice, the ice is melting with necessity if the sun warms it. It's not like two sheep in a herd that can be in conjunction, but they could also exist independently of each other. But on the other hand, while the two sheep are of the same kind, they are both sheep, here the sun with its heat and the melting ice are of completely different kind. And this quality of the sort of conjunctions that Kant calls a nexus, this is what limits our a priori knowledge very, very much, Kant says. Because all I can say a priori is that there must be some sort of conjunction with necessity, but I cannot say that A must be connected with B. I can only say A must be connected with some unknown X. I can't say a priori what A must be connected to. So, for example, when it comes to causality, what I can know a priori is that everything has a cause. Nothing can ever be observed by me which doesn't have a cause somewhere. But I can't know a priori what that cause is gonna be, since that cause could be of the same kind, but also of a completely different kind. So for that reason, if you see, let's say you see an insect, you know that the insect didn't just appear out of nowhere. It must have a cause for why it exists. But what that cause is, if the insect is born from eggs that were laid by other insects of the same kind, or if, which was believed since antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages and even in modern times until into the 18th or even into the 19th century, there is such a thing as spontaneous generation. That is, insects or maggots being born out of dirt, out of feces, out of rotting flesh. I mean, in the past, of course, they came to this belief because something as tiny as the eggs of a fly couldn't be observed by them. All they saw is if I take a piece of meat and I just let it rot, then suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, maggots will appear. But the thing is, there's nothing a priori telling me that this is the wrong explanation. It could be that maggots come out of nowhere, generating out of the rotten flesh. So I can only know a priori that the maggots must have some cause, but whether the cause is that flesh itself or whether that cause is an egg or something else, I can only find a posteriori. Now, the mathematical principles showed us that phenomena are quantifiable, and therefore mathematics can be applied to phenomena. The first group of dynamic principles, that is the principles of relation, they give the explanation of how what Kant calls pure natural science is possible, because they explain how it is even possible for there to be a nature under certain laws. Because what is nature to Kant? Nature is not simply that which is outside of me and which I perceive outside of me. Rather, to him, nature is a complex or connection of appearances in their existence according to necessary rules or according to laws, because that is what a necessary rule is. It is a law. And that is nature. It is, once again, it is a connection of various appearances that are connected in their existence through laws. And the three principles of relation Kant calls the analogies of experience, and they are what makes experience possible. If there could be something not under these three principles, then we could not experience it. Maybe sense, maybe perceive something, but not experience it. Because, well, the premise here is that experience is always about a necessary connection of perceptions. If I perceive right now that there's a dog barking out there, and at the same time or some seconds later there's a car crash happening over there, then that will not be an experience. That will be two different perceptions, but they don't have a necessary connection. I mean, the car didn't crash because a dog was barking somewhere. It just is a coincidence that it happened at the same time. For an experience, there must be a necessary connection, like the ice melting because the sun shines on it. Then I have experienced something. I have learned something about the world. And that means in order for there to be an experience, or in order for an experience to be possible, the various appearances must belong to the same nature. The ice that is melting must belong to the same nature as the sun by which it is melted, because that is what is nature, the necessary connection under laws of various appearances in their existence. So the existence of the melting, so of the water the ice turns into, depends on the existence of the sun according to a law. Therefore, they are in one nature, and only because they are in one nature can I experience them. If everything I perceived had its own nature, disconnected from everything else, then I could not make connections between my perceptions, and therefore I could not understand it, what it is I am perceiving here, and I would not make experience. Now, the three principles of relation depend on the three modes of time. Kant says the time has the mode of duration, of succession, and of being together at the same time. And everything that we perceive, because it must ultimately be in our inner sense and therefore in the form of time, must be perceived as having a duration or succeeding one another in time or being at the same time. However, the succession can of course be a subjective succession. So if I'm in Berlin right now, if I now go to Paris, then the representation of Berlin, having perceived Berlin, will be succeeded by perceiving Paris. That doesn't mean, however, that Paris is caused by Berlin, because I could, of course, also go the other way. I could turn back and travel from Paris to Berlin again, and then the perception of Berlin would succeed the perception of Paris again. So here, the succession is subjective. It's just in me. But when it comes to causality, the succession is objective. So it can't just be turned around. Paris is not the cause of Berlin, because yes, I can perceive Paris after Berlin, but I can also perceive Paris first. But the lumberjack hacking the tree with his axe is the cause of the tree falling down, because here it's not just me subjectively who first sees the lumberjack at work and then the falling tree, but rather this is objective. I have to first see the lumberjack and then the falling tree. I can't reverse this. So when there's causality, the succession must be objective according to a rule which connects and makes dependent on one another these different states. Well, and then how do I know that something doesn't just succeed each other, but is together at the same time, even if subjectively the different representations may succeed each other in my mind? Well, Kant says, I know that something is in the same time if it is in community with one another. So if it mutually depends on one another. So let's take my body and my t-shirt. How do I know that they exist at the same time? Well, because I feel the t-shirt on my body. And because my body is carrying the t-shirt. If I imagined that the t-shirt didn't exist at the same time, then I wouldn't feel it. And if I imagined that my body didn't exist at the same time as the t-shirt being here, then the t-shirt would not just float here in space, it would have to fall down to the ground. So they depend on one another, and therefore they must be in the same time. And this is true even for things that are further apart. They still must be in some sort of community. Like if I now go to Paris, I mean, it could be possible that Berlin vanishes and ceases to exist as soon as I turn my back to it, and Paris only comes into being when I approach it. And the fact that I can turn back and go back to Berlin from Paris is not really proof that Berlin still existed while I was in Paris. Because it could be possible that it stopped to exist, and now when I go back, Paris stops to exist and Berlin comes back into being. But they do exist at the same time because there's a community between them. They can influence one another at the same time. And I mean, with our modern technology, this becomes only more obvious and apparent than it was at Kant's time. I mean, I can call someone in Paris. I can even make a video call and see him live in Paris. So, meaning Berlin and Paris can at the same time influence one another. But this, so both this necessary succession that happens in causality, as well as this being at the same time and influencing each other at the same time, both of it requires the duration. And duration, of course, corresponds to the first category of relation, so to the category of substance. So here this is analogous to what I said in my lectures on the table of categories and on the table of judgments. There I said that according to Kant, the category of causality and of community depend on that of substance, because it is two substances which have a causal relationship where one causes the other, and it is two substances that are in a community. And likewise, I said this about the judgments. The hypothetical and the disjunctive judgment depend on the categorical judgment, because in the hypothetical judgment, I'm saying that one categorical judgment is the condition of the other. And in the disjunctive judgment, I say that either one or the other categorical judgment is true. So just like that, when it comes to the principles of relation, the principle of causality and that of community require that of the substantiality. Because Kant says, I need something in the world which has duration, so which has a sort of permanence, or else I could not even perceive change in the world. Change has to happen on something which is unchanged. Otherwise, I could not realize that there's change. Maybe to make this more clear, you can imagine floating on a boat in the ocean. No sails, no motor, just a boat floating in the wide ocean. Now, how do you know that the boat is moving and not staying in the same place? Of course, you could maybe look at the stars, and if you see throughout several nights that the constellations seem to change, then you know that you moved. Or if you are close to the shore, you can see that you are moving when looking at the shore. But if you imagine just a wide ocean and just a wide, clear blue sky and nothing ever happening, you can't see if you change your position or stay in the same position. Just like in space, if you imagine there was just one single planet, you could not say whether that planet moves through space or stays in the same place always. We can say that the Earth is moving in relation to the sun, for example, but we couldn't say so if it was the only thing there was. So movement can be perceived if there's something stationary in relation to which that movement happens. So once again, for every change, for every succession, we need some sort of duration. And these reflections lead Kant to formulating the three principles of relation, so the three analogies of experience, as he calls them. And they are first corresponding to substantiality, that throughout all the change in the world, substance doesn't change, only accidents change. And therefore, no substance can come into being or be destroyed. And this is indeed something that we automatically assume. The common person assumes this, the natural scientist assumes this. He assumes that matter or energy can't be produced out of nowhere or can't be destroyed, it can only be changed. So Kant gives this example: if we were to weight an object and then burn it and then weight the ash, and we would find that the ash is less heavy, we would not assume that part of the original weight just vanished, that part of the substance was just completely destroyed in the flames. Rather, we would assume that part, so to say, flew away in the smoke, went up into the air. And we would assume that if we could catch the smoke and weight it, then adding the smoke's weight to the ash's weight would give us exactly the weight of the original burned object. But why assume this? It's not something we know from experience. Rather, we know this a priori because it is a condition of the possibility of experience. If new substances could just appear or old substances could just disappear, then in that chaos we could not make experience. The second principle, corresponding to the category of causality, says exactly that everything happening in the world must have a cause. In the world, in nature. So not everything in total. This is not a statement about things in themselves, but in the realm of experience, in the sensual world, everything must have a cause. Maybe we can't always find the cause easily, but we cannot ever assume that something that happens just happens because it happens. We must assume that it has some sort of cause. And again, everyone will assume that. Kant does admit that the principles of relation and modality have less self-evidence than the ones of quantity and quality. That's not to say that they are less true or that we can be less certain of them, just that the certainty is a more discursive one I have to be convinced of through arguments. It's not so self-evident and intuitive. And so therefore, there can be and have been people who deny this principle, who say, no, not everything must have a cause. While there are probably no people who will easily deny the principle of quality and say that, no, not everything must have a certain intensity, must have a certain degree. But the thing is that even those people who will deny this principle in theory, who will deny it with their words, they won't deny it with their deeds. They won't truly believe this. This will just be some sort of ideology that they maybe have been taught because it's the zeitgeist, or that they have come to through some wrong reasoning. But their true belief will lie elsewhere. So even a person who tells you they don't believe in causality, when they hear a sound, a loud sound coming from their right, they will automatically turn their head to the right, because they will assume that there is something, and there is something on their right side, not on their left side, which caused this sound. And if you go to a person who denies causality, and if you beat in his teeth, he will probably be angry at you, and he will probably not accept you just saying, the pain you just felt was not caused by my fist hitting your face. It's a total coincidence that it occurred at the same time, but it was not caused by that. No, everyone will immediately and a priori assume that everything happening around him and to him does have a cause and is necessary by that cause, through that cause. And lastly, the last of these three principles, corresponding to the category of community, is that everything in the world, everything in nature, must be in community with one another. So must in some way, directly or more indirectly, influence each other. I mean, with the things around me, it's very direct. They may influence me because I can see them or feel them or whatever. But even with further away things, I mean, we can still see stars that are millions of light years away. And likewise, our light, the light of our star, reaches them. And you could not take a single piece out of this universe, a single atom, without in one way or another, no matter how small, and no matter how indirect, influencing everything else. I mean, even if a far away galaxy suddenly vanished, we would stop receiving light from there. And also it would probably have some influence on gravity and therefore on the direction of the other surrounding galaxies. So everything in the world forms one community. I mean, this community is what it means for various things to be part of one world. It means they form one community. If there was one thing that was not connected with the other things in some way or the other, then it would simply not be part of the same world. It would be in its own world, in some sort of parallel universe. But if I, as the same person, perceive two different things, unless I want to assume that I was somehow put into a different world in the meantime, or some portal into another world opened and let me glimpse into that other world, then I must assume that these two things are part of the same world and therefore in some, even if indirect or remote, connection to each other. And the important point is that these three principles, so substances can't be created or destroyed, everything that happens must have a cause, and all the things are part of one common world, one common nature. These principles, they are principles that everyone goes by. Again, even those people who may deny those principles, when you talk to them about those principles, they will still unconsciously and without reflecting about it assume those principles. And only through these principles is experience possible. If these three principles weren't true, then we couldn't make experiences. We could maybe perceive things happening, but it would be a chaos we are perceiving that we could not make sense of. Experience, necessary connections, a system of perceptions requires these three principles, and therefore they are the basis, Kant says, of pure natural science. And all empirical natural science is based on them. Every natural scientist, even if unconsciously, assumes these three principles. And we could not find empirical laws of how exactly causality works, which cause exactly causes which effect, if we didn't assume, for example, that there is a cause at all, that there is this general and not empirical but a priori law of causality. Now, the thing is with Kant that everyone always, even if unconsciously, believes in these three principles and follows these three principles. And we assume these principles to be true a priori, not just from our experience. But how can we know this? What Kant has achieved is proving these principles. And he has proved them in the only possible way. That is not dogmatically, but critically. He has given a transcendental proof. Because here you can go back to my lecture on dogmatic, skeptic, and critical philosophy, because a dogmatic proof to Kant would mean not dogmatic in the sense of blind belief, no, but it would mean a proof that tries to prove these three principles or these three laws of nature, you could say, general laws of nature. A dogmatic proof would try to prove then as something that is actually true out there, so independently of us, that is true in respect to the things in themselves. And that is something we can't prove. We can't be sure that the things in themselves, that here substances have duration, or everything is caused, or everything is forming one world which is connected, which is a community. So if we believe in transcendental realism and assume that we are dealing with the things in themselves, then we can't possibly know that these principles are true. We can maybe then assume that these are our principles, that we can't help but think that way. But this just goes to show what I explained in previous lectures, that transcendental realism necessarily needs to skepticism. So I would then say maybe I have to think according to these three principles, and therefore the world appears to me as following these three principles. But maybe the world in itself actually doesn't follow these three principles. And therefore the world that surrounds me seems to follow these three principles, but maybe it actually doesn't. Maybe I just can't help seeing it that way. But if you follow Kant and assume transcendental idealism, then you realize that the things you perceive, the things that appear to you, must indeed follow these principles. It doesn't just seem like that to you, it must be that way. Now, the things in themselves, they must not necessarily follow those principles, but those don't appear to you, or else they would stop being things in themselves. But the things that appear to you must appear under these principles, and that's not just an illusion you have subjectively, because that is objectively true, because as objects they are appearances. That is their nature as objects. They are what appears to you, and therefore they must be under the laws which are necessary for you to make an experience. Everything that appears to you must appear within the conditions of the possibilities of experience, or else it could not appear to you. And therefore, we have a transcendental proof that these three principles really are true, really are in place, insofar as it comes to the perceivable nature, to the nature appearing to us. Finally, there are the three principles of modality, which Kant calls the postulates of the empirical thinking in general. And the first of those, corresponding with the category of possibility, says that possible is that which fits together with the formal conditions of our experience. What does that mean? Well, our experience has two parts, as I explained in previous lectures. It is, after all, both sensual and intellectual. The sensual part, if we just look at the formal side, is time and space. So everything I experience, I must experience in time and space. The intellectual part, on the other hand, is the concept. Everything I experience, I must somehow conceptualize and connect through concepts in order to understand it. So that means that possible is that which fits together with these two formal conditions. Possible is that which could appear in time and space, and of which I can make a concept which doesn't contradict itself. So if something doesn't fit these formal conditions, it is impossible. That means that, for example, something like God, of God I can make a concept which isn't self-contradicting, but God cannot appear in time and space. Therefore, God is impossible. So I will stress that this is not talking about possibility or impossibility as referring to things in themselves. So with this, Kant is not saying that there can't be a God in the supersensual realm, but as a phenomenon, God is impossible. So as part of the world, as part of nature, God is impossible. I will never possibly have an experience of God, because that would then have to appear in time and space. So if God wanted me to experience him somehow, he would have to somehow appear in time and space. As I said previously, like, for example, he appeared to Moses in the burning bush, but then I would not experience God as he really is, right? Because God is not really a burning bush. I would only experience the way God chose to appear to me. God as he actually is impossible to experience. On the other hand, something like a circle with angles or a four-angle triangle may in some way meet the sensual conditions of experience. That is, a circle could be perceived in space, and something with angles, with three angles over four angles, could be perceived in space. But the concept contradicts itself. the concept of a circle and of angles, they don't fit together. And therefore, a circle with angles is also impossible. So, for something to be possible as a phenomenon, it must meet these formal conditions. It must be able to appear in time and space, and it must fit under a non-contradicting concept. Existence, according to the second of these principles, of these postulates, existence is when something is in accordance not just with the formal conditions of experience, but also with the material conditions of experience. Well, what is the material side of experience? The truly empirical, to Kant, that is always sensation. So that means whatever exists must be able to be sensed by us. It must give us some sort of sense impression, either directly, like we see it or feel it or taste it or whatever, or at least indirectly. That is, like Kant would, for example, name the magnetic power. We can't sense it as such, like maybe some birds can, he says, but we can sense the effect it has when it pulls iron to it. So that is the condition for something existing. We can only say that something exists if either we have a sense impression from it, or we have a sense impression that at least indirectly is caused by it. Could also be the sense impression we receive from some apparatus, from some computer. Could be a sense impression we receive only if we magnify it through a telescope or a microscope. But in some way, directly or indirectly, a thing must give us certain impressions, or else we can't say that it exists. And lastly, the final principle says necessary is that whose connection to that which exists is determined according to general principles of experience. So let's say the ice melting is necessary if the sun warms the ice. Why is it necessary? Because it is connected with that which exists, that is the sun, according to general rules of experience. So as a rule, I cannot possibly perceive the sun warming the ice without also perceiving that the ice melts. There's a necessary connection here. I will point out, when it comes to these last three principles, these postulates of the empirical thinking, that once again you can note modality being special and different from the other three groups of categories. I already pointed that out when talking about the table of categories, and before that when talking about the table of judgments, that Kant says the modality is not so much bringing something new, because it is only about how we think something. And that is what you can note here too, right? The other principles, so the axiom of viewing and the anticipation of perception and the three analogies of experience, they are synthetic judgments a priori that really teach us something new about the world, about nature. I learn something from them. I learn that everything is extended. I learn that every sensation has an intensity. I learn that all substances remain, that everything has a cause, that everything is in community. On the other hand, these three postulates of the empirical thinking in general, they are not so much teaching me something new about the world, but rather about my thinking. They are, in a way, only further definitions of what possibility, existence, and necessity mean. But still, as such, they serve an important function, once again, for our determining power of judgment, because once again they narrow it down to the realm of experience. They show us that we can really only use these three categories of possibility, existence, and necessity within the realm of experience. Because experience, either the formal conditions of experience or the material conditions of experience or the necessary connection of experience, that is really everything I can base these categories on. So Kant would say that even some mathematical concept like a circle, I could not say that this is possible if it didn't fit the formal conditions of experience. So only because the pure space of geometry is based on my form of viewing and is therefore the same space in which I am viewing all the objects outside of me, and therefore the circle I'm imagining in pure space, something of that shape could actually exist in experience and could actually be viewed by me in empirical viewing. Only because of that can I say a circle is possible. Something that does not meet these criteria, of which I cannot have a non-contradicting concept and which cannot appear in time and space, of something like that, I cannot even say that it is possible. And this is very important to Kant. He stresses this. Most people, even atheists, would claim that God or life after death could at least be possible in theory. Maybe it isn't true, but it could be. But according to Kant, even that is saying too much. In order to judge that something is possible, we must understand why it would be possible. And we can understand that if we are talking about sensual objects, because then we can say if it is something that could appear in time and space, like a unicorn or a dragon, then sure, why shouldn't it be possible if its concept doesn't contradict itself? But if it's something that goes completely beyond our experience, we cannot even say whether it's possible or not, because what would we base this judgment on? All we can say is it is possible to be thought of. The thought doesn't contradict itself. But that doesn't mean that the thing that we are thinking doesn't maybe contain a contradiction in its nature that we just don't realize. And likewise, as I already said, we can only say something exists if it affects us either directly or, like magnetic power, indirectly. If it causes directly or indirectly some sort of sensation. And finally, when it comes to necessity, Kant stresses that we can only ever talk about necessity in the connections of the world. That means we can only ever talk about hypothetical necessity. So we can say something is necessary when something else is the case. So as being caused of that other thing, it is necessary. The ice melting is necessary if the sun shines on the ice. The window breaking is necessary if I throw a stone against the window. But I can never speak of absolute necessity. I can never say something simply is necessary, not necessary as an effect of this or that cause, but it just is necessary, because I only understand necessity in relation to my actual experience, not independent of other things it is related to. And this means, Kant says, that the only thing we really understand to be necessary is the conditions, the states, that is the accidents of substances. but never the substances themselves. I can understand that if I dye my t-shirt blue, it is now necessary for its state to change from red to blue. But I cannot understand how it is necessary that matter, out of which my t-shirt and all the other things are made, that matter exists at all. And this, once again, is important later on, because if I only understand necessity in relation to things that actually exist, but not necessity in an absolute sense, then I cannot prove that God is necessary and therefore exists. Because sure, if I could prove God's necessity, I would have proved his existence, because that's what necessity means. What is necessary definitely exists. It must exist. But I cannot prove that, because I can only prove necessity in relation to other things, not independent of them. So these three categories of modality have to be limited to our actual experience. And once again, with these principles, they are conditions of the possibility of experience. So everything we ever experience must follow these principles, and we can try to go beyond these principles in our thinking, independently of our sensuality and even time and space as pure forms of viewing. But then that thinking will be empty, and we don't really know even what we are thinking, and definitely not if what we are thinking is possible or actually true. And that is exactly the result of the critique of pure reason and of Kant's epistemology. We can have synthetic judgments a priori, but they can only predict how our experience will be. The general laws our experience has to follow. This is exactly why we can talk about it a priori. Has to follow, because if it didn't follow these general laws, it wouldn't be experience. We couldn't understand it then. And since we do understand it, since we have experience, we know it follows these laws. But more we can't say. We can't make synthetic judgments a priori about transcendent things like God. That is basically the result of the critique of pure reason. Now, I said that according to Kant, the thinking faculty has three parts: intellect, power of judgment, and reason. And so next I want to talk about the last part, about reason. And it is exactly this, because reason by its nature desires totality, desires the absolute. It is exactly this which compels us to go beyond our sensuality, to transcend the realm of experience. And that's why, as Kant says, reason becomes dialectic. That is, it gets lost and tangled up in wrong arguments by which it sort of fools itself into certain beliefs about the transcendent, about, for example, God or freedom or the soul. And that's why in the second big half of the critique of pure reason, Kant tries to disentangle this dialectic and to show the errors in these supposed arguments that our reason come up with. But the basic result of the critique of pure reason is already set with what I said so far. What comes next is basically just the application of that, and basically just a further proof of that, the further proof that we can't go beyond experience in our thinking. We will only come up with arguments that may seem true, but at a closer look actually are wrong arguments that don't prove anything. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.